Tears streamed down Fatima's cheeks as she sat silently on the edge of her bed, the room dimly lit by a flickering bedside lamp. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of another bitter argument. Ayaz had stormed out once again, slamming the door behind him. Their marriage was nearing its 5th year, yet not a single night passed without hostility or hurtful silence. She had tried everything: patience, love, even silence, but nothing softened his cold distance. The truth was ugly and unbearable. Ayaz, her husband, could never fulfill the role of a man. He was impotent. And while that should have sparked compassion or a mutual effort to heal, it became the core of their emotional decay. Fatima had lived with the secret like a slow poison. No one outside these 4 walls knew what she endured. Not the hollow wedding night where Ayaz, after handing her a meaningless gift, quietly confessed his condition, then turned his back and fell asleep. Not the empty mornings filled with avoidance and sterile affection. He had promised treatment, but as the years went by, she never once saw him take a pill or visit a doctor. Whenever she raised the subject, his reaction was explosive: furious yelling, accusations of insensitivity, and a rage that left her shattered. Over time, she stopped asking. She stopped hoping. That night, as she sat crying into her scarf, the bedroom door slowly creaked open. Fatima looked up, expecting perhaps the sound of regret in her husband's footsteps, but it was Raza, her 15-year-old brother-in-law, who stood there. He had grown tall, almost unrecognizable from the 10-year-old child she met on her wedding day. His face was filled with worry. Seeing her in tears, he rushed to her side and gently wrapped his arms around her shoulders. Fatima leaned into him without hesitation. Raza had always been like a son to her, the only warmth in a house that had become emotionally frozen. His embrace was innocent and comforting. He had always been there, through her quiet sobs, through the slammed doors, through every lonely dinner she ate alone. "Why do you cry for him?" Raza whispered, stroking her hair gently. "He doesn't deserve your tears." Fatima wanted to answer, but her throat was dry from hours of weeping. What could she say anyway? That she was a married woman who had never felt like a wife? That she was still untouched, emotionally starved, and painfully invisible in her own home? Raza stepped back slightly and smiled in an attempt to lighten the mood. "Let's play a game," he said softly, trying to distract her from her pain. "Something to make you smile." Fatima wiped her tears and chuckled weakly. "You're always talking about games." In that moment, she had no idea that the game Raza wanted to play would shatter the very fabric of her world and open the door to secrets darker than anything she had imagined. Fatima smiled faintly at Raza's suggestion, thinking it was just another one of his childish attempts to distract her. Over the years, he had always been that innocent presence, popping into the kitchen to tease her, making silly jokes during her lonely afternoons, and clinging to her like a little brother who had no one else. After all, he had lost his mother at a young age, and in many ways, she had stepped into that space, nurturing him, feeding him, comforting him through nightmares and exams. "What kind of game?" she asked softly, brushing away the last of her tears. Raza grinned and took the end of her scarf, wrapping it gently around her wrists. "Let's play something fun," he said, almost too cheerfully. Fatima blinked, confused, but still trusting. "Why are you tying my hands?" she asked, laughing nervously. "You always interrupt," he teased. "Just wait, it'll make sense." Fatima didn't resist. There was a familiarity in his presence, a belief that he was still the boy she had helped raise. Even when he reached into the drawer and took out a roll of tape, she assumed he was playing a prank, maybe something dramatic to lighten her mood. But as he gently placed the tape across her lips, she began to feel a strange unease creep into her chest. Her eyes widened slightly, but he just smiled, not cruelly, but with an unsettling calmness. "Just for a moment," he said. Then he pulled out his phone and began playing a video. Bound and silenced, Fatima had no choice but to watch, and what she saw didn't just disturb her, it cracked her from the inside. The video showed her husband Ayaz in a dimly lit room sitting beside a woman who clearly wasn't Fatima. The two were close, too close. The sounds, the gestures, the expressions were unmistakably intimate. Ayaz, who had told Fatima he was incapable of intimacy, was clearly anything but. And the woman with him, bold, painted, and laughing, could only be one thing: a courtesan. Fatima felt her breath catch in her throat. Her chest heaved as shame and rage collided inside her. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation, years in the making. She had believed Ayaz's lie, lived under its shadow, and swallowed her self-worth for half a decade, all while he gave himself freely to someone else. By the time the video ended, her face was burning. She couldn't look at Raza, but she felt his eyes on her. He removed the tape from her lips, and before she could utter a word, he spoke in a low, measured voice. "It doesn't matter where I got the video," he said. "What matters is what you saw in it." Fatima's hands trembled, her mind swirled with questions, with disbelief, with horror. But beneath it all, something else stirred too, a crack in the illusion she had lived under for far too long, and with that crack came a dangerous freedom, the truth. Fatima sat frozen, her wrists still loosely bound, the taste of betrayal bitter in her mouth. The room was silent, except for the low hum of the ceiling fan and the echo of her own shallow breaths. Raza sat across from her, calm and strangely composed, as if what had just happened was a necessary step, like ripping a bandage from an old wound. She slowly pulled her scarf from her wrists, her fingers numb. Her mind raced, but her heart felt oddly still, as if it had gone into hiding. For 5 years she had believed a lie that had stolen her womanhood, her dreams, her identity. She had endured sleepless nights, silent dinners, and lifeless conversations, all because she thought her husband was a victim of an unfortunate medical condition. But now she saw what had been hidden in plain sight. Her voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "Why did you show me this?" Raza didn't look away. "Because someone needed to. You deserve to know. You've suffered enough." Fatima stared at him, her eyes hollow with disbelief. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," he replied quietly. "I found the video by accident. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And I couldn't let you live in that darkness anymore." His words struck her harder than the video itself. This wasn't just about Ayaz's deception. It was about years of being denied truth, affection, and dignity. And the worst part? Everyone had known, her husband's father, possibly others. They had all allowed her to walk into a marriage built on lies just to maintain appearances. She had been a sacrifice at the altar of family honor. Fatima stood up, her legs shaky but determined. "So what now?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Raza hesitated, then said something that made her breath catch. "You leave him. You take your life back. And if you'll let me, I want to be the one who gives you the happiness he never did." She stared at him in disbelief. "You? Raza, you're a child. You've grown up calling me by name, running around like my shadow. I raised you." His face remained serious. "I'm not a child anymore, Fatima. I may have grown up beside you, but I see you, not as someone who pitied me, but as someone I've always cared for. Loved." The word landed between them like thunder. Fatima turned her face away. She couldn't process it. Not now, not after everything. The betrayal of Ayaz still stung like acid, but now this, Raza's confession, added a strange, confusing weight to it all. "I need time," she said finally. Her voice was tired, almost defeated. Raza nodded. "I'll wait. Just don't go back to being blind. You deserve more than silence and shadows." As he left the room, the air felt different. He had shattered the illusion. Now, Fatima had to decide whether to step into the light or stay buried in the lie. Fatima didn't sleep that night. Her body lay motionless in bed, but her mind was unraveling at terrifying speed. The image of Ayaz in that video kept flashing in her head. The false tenderness on his face, the passion he had never once shown her, the lies he had so carefully woven around her life. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a robbery. He had stolen her years, her youth, and her right to love and be loved. And Raza, his words echoed even louder, "You deserve more than silence and shadows." She had always brushed him off as a boy, clinging to the role of an older sister, a caretaker. But now she couldn't deny the shift. The child she once guided had grown into someone who not only saw her pain but dared to stand against it. The next morning, Ayaz returned home as if nothing had happened. He walked past her like a stranger, tossed his keys on the table, and settled into the living room chair, scrolling through his phone. The audacity struck her like a slap. Fatima stood at the doorway, watching him with a kind of calm she didn't recognize in herself. "I want a divorce," she said. He didn't look up. "What now?" she repeated, this time louder, firmer. "I want a divorce, Ayaz." Ayaz raised his eyes slowly, met her gaze for the first time in days, and blinked as if she'd spoken a foreign language. "Is this some kind of drama again?" he scoffed. "Because I'm not in the mood." "I'm serious," she replied, walking into the room with quiet determination. "I know everything about her, about the lies, about you never wanting me in the first place." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with an indifferent shrug, he leaned back and muttered, "Good, saves me the trouble." And just like that, he said the words. The final three that ended everything. Fatima stood there, not crying, not screaming, just breathing, for the first time in years, like she had lungs again. There was no ceremony to the ending, no rage, just the dull click of a door finally unlocking. She turned to leave, her heart pounding, her hands cold. Her father-in-law emerged from his room, confusion in his eyes. When she told him what happened, he tried to stop her, reason with her. But Ayaz, unmoved, simply walked away, confirming it with silence. That was all that Sun and based on the confirmation she needed. And then, before she could step outside with her suitcase, Raza appeared. He stood between her and the door. "Don't go," he said. "If he's let go of you, let me hold on to you." The room fell silent. Their father watched, stunned. Raza turned to him and said, "I want to marry her." It was the beginning of something unthinkable. But for the first time, Fatima didn't feel fear. She felt something else, possibility. Fatima stood frozen, her suitcase still in her hand, her thoughts colliding in chaos. The word marriage echoed louder than everything else in the room. Raza had said it with such clarity, such sincerity, that it pierced the thick fog of grief clinging to her heart. Her eyes darted to her father-in-law, expecting anger, disbelief, maybe outrage. But what she saw instead was something more complex. Shock, yes, but not rejection. "You can't be serious," she whispered to Raza. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," he replied, stepping closer. "You were never treated like someone's wife. Let me give you that. Let me give you everything Ayaz never did." Fatima felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. 5 years of shame, loneliness, and silence had taught her to doubt every good thing. And now this boy, this young man, was standing before her offering something that sounded dangerously like love. "But people will talk," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll say I raised you, that I used you, that I married my own brother-in-law." "I don't care," Raza said firmly. "Let them talk. What do they know of what you've suffered? What do they know of what I feel?" His father finally spoke, his voice rough but not harsh. "I never wanted things to end up like this. I thought I was doing what was best for this family. But I see now. You were wronged, Fatima, deeply." She stared at him in disbelief. "You knew, didn't you? You knew Ayaz wasn't impotent." He looked down in shame. "Yes, I knew, but I also knew he loved someone else. Someone unfit for this household. I thought marrying him to a good woman like you would change him. I was wrong." Fatima felt something inside her finally snap, not from anger but release. The lies were no longer hers to carry. The burden had shifted back to those who had placed it on her shoulders. "I didn't come here to break rules," she said, looking at Raza. "I came because I had nowhere else to go." "Then stay," he said gently. "Not out of pity, not because you're broken, but because I see you. I've always seen you." For a moment, she let herself believe it, that someone truly saw her, not as damaged, not as leftover, but as a woman who still had life and love to give. She turned to his father. "Do you really accept this?" He nodded slowly. I've watched you for 5 years. I know your worth. And just like that, the impossible became reality. The wedding was quiet. No fanfare, no guests. Just the blessing of a father who had once turned away from truth but now embraced it. Fatima married Raza not as a last resort but as a woman reclaiming her life. And in that quiet moment, something deep within her finally healed. The morning after their quiet wedding, Fatima woke up to a silence that no longer suffocated her. The same room that had once witnessed her loneliness now held the scent of a fresh beginning. The air felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because she no longer had to carry it alone. Raza was already awake, setting a cup of tea beside her bed with a shy smile. There was no awkwardness in his presence, only gentleness. It was hard to process how quickly life had changed. Just days ago, she was a broken wife trapped in a hollow marriage. Now she was a wife again, but to someone who actually looked at her, listened to her, and stood up for her. As the hours passed, Fatima expected guilt to creep in, but it didn't. What replaced it was an unfamiliar feeling, relief. There was no more pretending, no more chasing a man who never wanted her. Raza wasn't perfect, but he was honest. He didn't look at her with duty. He looked at her with emotion that had been building in silence for years. Her father-in-law kept his distance at first, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamic in the house. But in small ways, he began showing his acceptance, asking if she needed anything, placing his hand on her head in passing, mentioning her name with a softness that hadn't been there before. Fatima noticed. She noticed everything now. By the end of the week, her body began to feel strange, tired, slightly nauseous, with an odd fluttering in her lower belly. At first, she ignored it, thinking the stress of recent events was simply playing tricks on her health. But when the feeling didn't go away, she visited a nearby clinic alone. When the doctor smiled and said, "Congratulations," Fatima stared at her in disbelief. Pregnant. She was going to be a mother. A deep silence settled over her as she walked out of the clinic. Her hands trembled as she held the test results. She sat on a bench outside, staring at the paper, unable to move. After all the years of longing, of wondering if something was wrong with her, the very idea of carrying a child felt surreal. When she returned home, Raza noticed something had shifted in her face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. She hesitated, then nodded. "Everything's finally okay." That night, as she lay beside him, she whispered the truth into the darkness. Raza didn't say a word at first. Then, with the same steadiness he had shown when he stood up for her, he placed his hand gently on her belly and said, "We're not just starting over, we're building something new." And for the first time in years, Fatima fell asleep not in tears, but in quiet joy. Pregnancy brought with it a quiet transformation Fatima never expected. Her world, once gray and full of unanswered questions, began to feel strangely vibrant. Every morning she woke to Raza's quiet care, whether it was warming her tea just right or watching her with silent curiosity as she dozed off mid-conversation. He didn't hover, but he was always present. And it wasn't grand gestures that comforted her, it was his consistency. Fatima sometimes caught herself staring at him. She had watched this boy grow, scolded him for not doing his homework, teased him over his messy hair, and now he was the man she leaned on. It was a thought that might have once disturbed her, but now it humbled her. There were still whispers from the outside world, judgments from those who couldn't grasp what she had been through. But Fatima no longer lived for their approval. For the first time, she was choosing life, not endurance. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast golden shadows across the yard, Raza placed his head gently in her lap. His voice was soft. "Do you ever regret it?" She ran her fingers through his hair, her heart steady. "No," she whispered. "I only regret waiting so long to see what was always right in front of me." In that moment, Fatima realized love had never been about age or roles or appearances. It had always been about who stood beside you when the world turned its back. Though peace had returned to her home, Fatima knew that healing from the past wasn't a single moment, it was a slow, quiet process. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, when the world was still, she would think of Ayaz, not with longing but with questions. How could someone live such a double life? How could he look into her eyes every day knowing the truth? But then, She would hear Raza stir beside her, or feel the faint flutter of life growing inside her, and those questions would lose their weight. The past had been cruel, but it no longer defined her. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of the courtyard, watering the plants. Her father-in-law approached her slowly, holding a small wooden box. He handed it to her silently. Inside were photographs from her wedding, letters Ayaz had written but never sent, and a gold chain that had once belonged to Raza's mother. "I should have done things differently," the old man said, his voice low. "You were never meant to suffer." Fatima closed the box gently. "But I did. And maybe I had to, so I'd know the value of what I have now." They stood in silence, the sun warming the quiet between them. Later that evening, Raza found her sitting alone, holding the gold chain. Without a word, he sat beside her and placed his hand on hers. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. He looked at her belly, then into her eyes. "Neither am I." In the quiet of that moment, Fatima understood. Sometimes life doesn't return what you lose. It gives you something else. Something unexpected. And perhaps even better. The seasons shifted quietly, and with them, so did Fatima's life. What was once a home filled with silence and unmet dreams had now become a space where laughter returned, where warmth had found its way back through simple moments, a shared meal, an evening walk, the gentle planning of a future not built on duty, but on choice. Fatima often looked at Raza with quiet awe. He had once been a boy running through the house with untied shoelaces and innocent mischief in his eyes. Now he was her husband, protective, grounded, and endlessly patient. She never expected love to grow in such soil, but it had. Not like a fire, but like a tree, steady and deep-rooted. When their child was born, a son with Raza's curious eyes and her calm smile, Fatima wept without shame. Not from sorrow, but from a release. The pain, the betrayal, the years of waiting, all of it had led here. Raza held their son like a promise. "He'll know your strength," he whispered, "and your kindness." Fatima leaned into him, heart full, "And he'll know your loyalty." She no longer cared for the world's judgments. What mattered was that she had survived, she had reclaimed her life, and she had found someone who loved her not despite her scars, but because of them. Her story, once buried beneath silence and sorrow, had become something else entirely. A quiet rebellion, a new beginning, a love that defied all expectation. And in that simple, ordinary home, a woman who had once been forgotten now lived a life that mattered, with someone who never let her forget it.